The burden of government spending in America has exploded in the past 10 years. The Bush-Obama policies of handouts, subsidies, pork, giveaways, and bailouts have swollen the federal budget from $1.86 trillion to $3.7 trillion, an increase of nearly $2 trillion in just 10 years. It seems like Thomas Jefferson was right when he warned that the natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground. So does this mean it is impossible to restrain the growth of spending? Is fiscal responsibility just a fantasy, considering the corrupt relationships in Washington between politicians, interest groups, bureaucracies, and lobbyists? It's never easy to get politicians to do the right thing. My name is Dan Mitchell of the Cato Institute. This mini documentary from the Center for Freedom and Prosperity will show you with real-world examples that it is possible to curtail the burden of government spending. The first thing to understand is that Washington gets more tax money almost every single year. Not because politicians are raising our taxes, though they like to do that, but because of things such as economic growth, inflation, and more population. Indeed, revenues are projected to climb on average by about 7% annually over the next 10 years. So if we know revenues are growing about 7% each year, sound fiscal policy simply requires that politicians increase spending at a slower rate. It would be great to actually shrink the federal budget, of course, but even more modest steps yield dramatic results, as we explained in our video on balancing the budget. Let's start with the gipper. When Ronald Reagan took office, America's economy was in a tailspin, and federal spending was on an upward trajectory. Government spending was consuming more than 22% of national economic output, and the future looked pretty bleak. Unlike most other politicians, including a lot of his fellow Republicans, though, Reagan had a sense of what was wrong. In his inaugural speech, he said,
"In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem."
And he backed up his words with action. By the time he left office in 1989, the burden of federal spending had dropped to 21.2% of GDP. In other words, the private sector grew faster than the government. That is the definition of good fiscal policy. Let's look at some numbers from the historical tables of the budget. And we'll use inflation-adjusted figures so we can make fair comparisons. When Jimmy Carter left office, the federal government was spending a little bit more than $1 trillion for domestic programs, everything from education to Medicare. Reagan then took over and put government on a diet. And by 1989, when he left office, total domestic spending was about $1.08 trillion, higher, but only about $80 billion higher. To put it in terms that are easy for all of us to understand, inflation-adjusted domestic spending grew by an average of less than $10 billion annually, or just 1% each year, a lot slower than the economy was growing. And remember, the key variable is government spending as a share of GDP. Changes in that variable tell us whether we're on the right track, meaning the private sector is growing faster than the government. On this basis, Reagan was a champ. Total domestic spending fell from 15.7% of GDP when he entered office all the way down to 13.2% of GDP when he left office. Our other success story is Bill Clinton. He got off on the wrong foot, pushing through a big tax increase in his first year. Not surprisingly, this didn't work. Indeed, about a year and a half after the tax increase was enacted, Clinton's own budget office was estimating that future deficits would remain close to $200 billion. But to his credit, Clinton was not a big spender, not even during his first 2 years when the Democrats controlled Congress. And after the GOP landslide in 1994, Clinton's performance got even better. During his 8 years in power, domestic spending increased by 3% each year. That's about 3 times faster than the growth rate under Reagan, but it was a pretty good job compared to some other presidents. The key variable, as we stressed before, is making sure the private sector grows faster than the government. And that happened during the Clinton years. total domestic spending consumed 14.5% of GDP when Clinton took office, but it was down to 13.7% of GDP when he left office. And Clinton also benefited from the peace dividend, so he was able to reduce defense spending as well. As a result, the overall burden of government spending fell from 21.4% of GDP in 1993 down to 18.2% of economic output in 2001. No wonder projections of $200 billion deficits turned into the reality of big budget surpluses. This video has given you good news. We've looked at how a Republican president and a Democratic president both presided over policies to limit the burden of overall spending, and we've demonstrated domestic spending restraint is possible with the right policies. Now, let's conclude with some bad news. All of the progress of the Reagan-Clinton years has been wiped out by the profligacy of the Bush-Obama years. In the past decade, the burden of domestic spending rose by an average of more than $100 billion each year. And when you add in other budget categories such as defense and interest costs, it's easy to see why the nation is in fiscal peril. Fortunately, we know the solution. First, we're in a hole. Stop digging. Second, let's learn from Reagan and Clinton that the only way to solve the problem is fiscal restraint, especially limits on the growth of domestic spending. Do me a favor, please share this Center for Freedom and Prosperity video widely so more people understand what needs to be done.